On the afternoon of October 7th, 1780, Major Patrick Ferguson stood on a wooded ridge near the border of North and South Carolina and believed he had chosen the perfect place to fight. The mountain was not tall. It was a narrow, rocky rise covered in trees, brush, and broken ground. But to Ferguson, it looked like a fortress. His Loyalist army was on top. His enemies would have to climb toward him. The slopes would slow them down. His men could fire downhill. And if the rebels tried to rush the ridge, Ferguson's militia could drive them back with bayonets. On the mountain, it was a death trap, because below him, moving silently through the trees, were hundreds of frontier riflemen who had crossed mountains to find him. Many of them had come from settlements beyond the Appalachian Mountains, men who had been told to surrender to the British Crown or watch their homes burn. They had come to destroy the man who threatened them. Within 1 hour, Ferguson would be dead, and Britain's plan to conquer the American South would begin to collapse in the woods of Kings Mountain. To understand why this small mountain mattered, you have to go back to the disaster that made Britain believe the South was already theirs. The British had captured Charleston in May of 1780 in one of the worst American defeats of the entire Revolutionary War. Thousands of Continental soldiers were taken prisoner. Then came Camden. In August, Lord Cornwallis crushed an American army under Horatio Gates so badly that organized American resistance in the South seemed close to breaking. British commanders believed thousands of Loyalists were waiting in the Carolinas, men who still supported King George, men who only needed British protection before they would rise in force. The plan was to turn Americans against Americans, raise Loyalist militia, control the countryside, break Patriot resistance from the inside, then march north and roll up the rebellion from below. That was why Cornwallis sent Major Patrick Ferguson west. Ferguson was not an ordinary officer. He was intelligent, ambitious, and confident. He had designed an advanced breech-loading rifle earlier in his career, and he understood that frontier warfare was different from European battlefields. Cornwallis gave him a critical task: recruit Loyalists, protect the British left flank, keep the western settlements from rising behind the main British army. He gathered more than 1,000 Loyalists, mostly Americans who supported the Crown. Kings Mountain was not a normal battle between British redcoats and American rebels. It was almost entirely Americans fighting Americans. The only British regular officer on the field was Ferguson himself. That made the battle more personal and far more brutal. Ferguson believed intimidation would work. He sent warnings toward the mountain settlements, telling frontier patriots to stop opposing the Crown or face destruction. Instead, it enraged them. The men beyond the mountains had not been eager to march into the main war. They had their own settlements to defend, their own families to feed, and their own dangerous frontier to survive. But Ferguson's threat changed everything. If the British were coming over the mountains, then the war was coming to their homes. At Sycamore Shoals near present-day Tennessee, riflemen began assembling from frontier communities. Men under Isaac Shelby, John Sevier, William Campbell, Charles McDowell, and others prepared to cross the mountains and hunt Ferguson down. Many carried long rifles, slower to load than muskets, but deadly accurate in the hands of men raised in the woods. Hundreds of riflemen rode and walked through brutal country, crossing the Blue Ridge, pushing through rain, cold, mud, and mountain paths that punished both horses and men. Ferguson received word that Patriot militia were coming for him. He started pulling back toward Cornwallis, trying to get closer to the main British army. But he did not move fast enough. On October 6th, the pursuing militia selected their fastest men and horses. They left slower troops behind and pushed forward through the night in miserable weather. By the afternoon of October 7th, Ferguson stopped on Kings Mountain. To him, the ridge offered protection. To the men hunting him, it offered a target. Kings Mountain was shaped like a long, narrow spine. Its slopes were wooded. The top was limited. The ground made organized movement difficult. Ferguson placed his Loyalists near the crest and prepared for the militia to come up at him. But his position had a hidden weakness. The mountain protected him from one direction at a time. It did not protect him from all directions at once. The militia commanders divided their men into separate columns and moved around the ridge. Instead of forming one neat line, they spread through the trees and began to surround the mountain. At around 3 in the afternoon, the first shots cracked through the woods. Patriot riflemen climbed through smoke and brush, firing from behind trees and rocks. Ferguson's Loyalists answered from above. Muskets flashed along the ridge. Smoke drifted between the trunks. Ferguson rode along the line, trying to direct the defense and push his men into counterattacks. His Loyalists fixed bayonets and charged downhill, driving back Patriot riflemen who had no bayonets of their own. But this was the trap. When the Loyalists charged, the riflemen fell back into the trees. When the Loyalists turned and climbed back toward the crest, the riflemen followed. Then they started firing again. Ferguson could win small moments on one slope, but he could not be everywhere. Every time he drove one group back, another group was climbing somewhere else. The Patriot riflemen used cover. They picked targets. They aimed carefully. They loaded slowly, but made each shot count. The firing came from below, from the sides, from behind trees, from angles that made the entire mountain feel surrounded. The top of Kings Mountain was no longer a defensive position. It was a killing ground. Ferguson still refused to surrender. As the Patriot ring closed, he tried to break out. He gathered men and attempted to cut through the attackers. It was too late. Shots hit him. Then more shots. Patrick Ferguson, the only British officer on the field, the man sent to build Cornwallis's Loyalist shield in the west, was dead. The Loyalists began raising white cloths and calling for surrender. Some Patriots, still enraged by the brutal fighting in the South, kept firing for moments after the surrender began. Officers had to force control back into the chaos. The entire battle had lasted about 1 hour. More than 100 were killed. Hundreds more were wounded or captured. A force Cornwallis needed to secure his western flank had vanished. This was not just a battlefield defeat. It was the collapse of an idea. He had been hunted down by backcountry militia who gathered themselves, crossed mountains, surrounded his position, and destroyed his command in a single afternoon. After the battle, Cornwallis had to pull back into South Carolina. Patriot morale surged. Men who had watched Charleston fall and Camden collapse now saw proof that the British could be beaten in the South. 3 months later, another British detachment would be destroyed at Cowpens. After that came Guilford Courthouse, where Cornwallis won the field but lost so many men that victory felt like damage. Then came the road to Virginia. Then Yorktown. Kings Mountain did not win the war by itself, but it started a chain reaction at exactly the moment when the American cause in the South needed one. Thomas Jefferson later called it the turn of the tide of success. The British could capture cities. They could defeat continental armies. They could march through towns and issue proclamations, but they could not force the backcountry to kneel just by threatening it. Ferguson tried. The mountains answered. He believed fear would break the frontier. Instead, fear gave the frontier a target. And when the smoke cleared at King's Mountain, Britain had lost more than a militia commander. It had lost the illusion that the South could be conquered by turning Americans against each other. The mountains were not empty, the frontier was not passive, and the men Ferguson threatened were not waiting to be conquered. They were already riding toward him. If this story pulled you in, subscribe for more hidden battles, impossible traps, and the forgotten turning points that changed history. And tell us in the comments, was Patrick Ferguson defeated by bad strategy, bad terrain, or his own overconfidence?